This is an edited and sped up version of the process of me painting this Balor miniature, which actually belongs to my boyfriend, for this video as a nice example of painting a miniature and so that I have a reason to actually get it painted in. It seemed like the most interesting and fun miniature of all the options I had to make a video about and to actually enjoy painting, as it would be a little bit more complicated and large, which made it more ideal for filming. I'm using various paints and mixing various colors to work a more wet and wet technique to paint the skin first. I'm erring on the side of more of a crimson red, and I'm working in the highlights and shadows in this initial base coat all at one, or alla prima. One layer and wet and wet. In order to work this way, you actually have to work quite quickly because of how fast acrylic paint dries, especially on the surfaces of a miniature. This miniature model comes pre-primed and ready to paint. I'm trying to make sure I quickly mix in some shadows. I'm also using a fairly soft yet stiff brush. This type of brush is a makeup brush I got from the dollar store. I'm also using some fine point brushes like this one here, and I'm planning out that some things are going to be overlaid or painted with other colors. I'm not being quite as careful with edges I know will be covered in black or other very opaque colors. I'm getting the colors in quickly and blending in the edges, getting the shadows and highlights in, and trying to work fast. If there are areas where I go on top of spots that aren't supposed to be red, I intend to overlay them with opaque colors, especially things like white and black, before going with the proper color for that region. I'm usually trying to paint as fast as possible so as not to spend too much time on any one miniature, but also because I only have so much space to record video files and I don't want this video to be too long. There's actually a segment I didn't record and a lot of stuff I sped up extra and cut out here. I'm trying to do a proper job while also working quickly. I've studied a lot of things from other YouTube videos to get tips, plus figuring out what I can transfer over from my knowledge of normal painting on a flat surface, what my knowledge of digital painting can give me, and everything else I've ever painted with acrylics, plus what I've already learned by painting other miniatures. I'm bringing that information forward and everything I've seen in online miniature tutorials and trying to find my own style that I prefer, and I feel like painting the skin all at once, more like this, and working in wet and wet and as quickly as possible is more the style I enjoy and find works well for me. I'm doing kind of the same technique with everything here, but acrylic paint tends to need layers, so I do advise you understand that even if you want it to only be one coat, you might have to do 2 or sometimes even 3 coats. You might also need to plan things out if there are special effects or dry brushing or metallic effects you need to add on top of layers. Sometimes you need to put an underneath layer. A great example of a need for an underneath layer is sometimes for bright yellows. You don't want to put a bright yellow on black. It won't work, but it might take a lot of coats of yellow to get it bright. Your best bet is actually to put an undercoat of opaque white so that the brightness of the yellow glows through. This also means understanding it might take some time to finish a project like this, because there's literal drying time. You can sometimes use things like a heat gun or a blow dryer to help, but you don't want to melt things like plastic by getting them too hot. So I advise you allow things like acrylic paints to air dry. It doesn't really take very long at all for acrylic paints to dry. During this process, although I might have edited it out, I used a fine mist sprayer to spray some water on the paints multiple times during this process to ensure they remained moist. I also advise using a damp paper towel, maybe a little ripped piece or a piece of Kleenex, to clean up if you accidentally get paint in a spot you don't intend to. Saved myself a lot of trouble of getting paint in spots I didn't intend to and getting extra paint on my hands and in the wrong areas if I'd actually used blue tack or some other way of attaching it to a base and then holding that base rather than touching the miniature directly. This is a mistake I intend not to do while moving forward very much, as I've already gotten some old pill bottles and blue tack and everything set up. But when I went to get to work on this miniature, I kept feeling like because it's so large, it would be easy to hold areas that don't have any paint on them, easy not to get paint on my hands, but that was actually a mistake and I had to make a correction several times. The other reason why you'd want to hold onto a handle and not the miniature itself is that your hand oils and dirt on your hands will get on it, aside from wet paint issues. So moving forward, I hope not to make this mistake again, and I advise against you making it in the first place. Getting something you can hold in your hand, a large wooden dowel, an old pill bottle, or other things, and attaching the miniature firmly to it, though not in a permanent manner, something like blue tack, like I said, will allow you to hold onto that rather than holding onto the miniature directly, which is better for so many reasons. When I was planning it out, I looked at the example artwork and decided what I wanted to change. I didn't like the gray hair in the original artwork. I didn't like the steel color of the skulls. I wanted them to look more like bone. And I liked a lot of the rest of the coloration. Looking at it, I figured out which paints I could use to get colors closer to the ones I was envisioning. I didn't follow the reference exactly because I preferred to do it my own way. Here I'm using a certain amount of purple, but I wanted to keep things more on the dull side, but not dull in an ugly, boring, dead-looking way. More in a dirty kind of way, to represent the fact that it's a demon. I also went more with a parchment color than a buff titanium for the bone of the skulls because I felt that was more suitable for a demon. I knew I would need 2 coats for the wings. So I knew what I was painting here was just meant to be the underneath for what I was going to put on top later. Here's how it is at this stage, but you can tell it needs a second coat. Now, bringing it back in, I'm doing the second coat on all the things I've done so far and the first coat on things like underneath the wings. I don't need to be quite as detailed with the second coat for the skin because I've already gotten a lot of the shadows in. I'm going more in with the mid-tone and bringing some of the highlights back in. There are also times where I decide to deepen the shadows again. Basically, I go over the whole skin again. I sped up this part even more than the rest, just to touch up everything I've already done with a second coat. Basically, it's almost the exact same process as the first time, but a little bit less intense on how detailed I need to make it, because the underneath coat shines through once the 2 layers become one, if that makes any sense. I'm also making sure to add in not only highlights, but darker shadows, and to get any spots I missed. There are some tiny, tiny spots of gray of the original primer. Sometimes when the acrylic paint dries, it can actually pull back and leave tiny speckles. These need to be touched up. Hold the miniature on all kinds of different angles and look. I'm doing the first coat for the underneath of the wings, which is almost the same color as the base coats for the upper wings, but I made it slightly more brownish and slightly darker to emphasize the fact that the wings are probably going to be more in shadow at all times. I'm also going in and adding things in like tiny shadows, and I'm adding in an ombre effect which puts a darker burnt umber brown on the tips of the wings fading upwards. I'm also mixing a highlight color to put on the wings as part of the second coat. I do the main second coat and mix all this in. Now, the highlights are this paler pinky purple tone. I'm carefully placing them on top. The whole process of painting the top of the wings second coat is done quite quickly so that I'm working wet and wet and I'm actually blending the paints together. The hotter and drier the room or environment you're working in is, the faster the acrylic paint will dry. If you're in a cooler, slightly more damp place, the paint will dry slower. This should affect your working process. You need to remember to work even faster in hot, dry conditions, and you need to remember to mist spray your paint on the palette more often. You can also use a wet palette to slow down the drying process of paints, but most say to be cautious about metallic paints on the surface. I missed a section here where I painted black and the base coat of the hair, but that's because I forgot to record it. That's okay, this video is pretty long anyway. I'm putting a second coat underneath the wings and touching up any areas where there are little gaps or where it looks very bad. A lot of these are gray speckles that remain, and a lot of these are also just to deepen the color because it doesn't look good enough with only 1 coat of paint. When it doesn't look good enough with only 1 coat of paint, you probably should just do a second coat of paint rather than complaining about it. Remember that you only need to work as hard as you want to if miniatures are meant to be viewed far away, or you'll only have so much time to dedicate to the process. Find some time-saving tips to get the best results for the least effort at the fastest speed. But at the same time, sometimes you need to take the time and effort to do a proper job on things like these in order to be truly happy with what you've accomplished. You need to decide where to put your time and effort and why. Working wet on wet with a similar highlight color to the highlight color on the wings, I work in highlights into the hair when I do the second coat. As you can see, I'm using a matte medium here in order to mattify a little bit of a shinier paint. The one I'm using is Liquitex Parchment to try to make the skulls look less shiny. I didn't bother to really mattify the skin or the wing membranes, but I did use matte medium because I wanted that skull to be more matte colored. I could have started with more matte acrylics, but the parchment color was more the demonic skull tone I wanted. In some ways, I used colors that felt more correct for the mood of the miniature than I would have if I was trying to paint something more happy or from the prime material plane. As this is an evil demon from a hell realm, it felt more like things should have a coloration that's more on the gray side or more dingy, dark, or dirty looking than it would be if it was a happy creature that's just from the savannah frolicking about, or even just a skeleton of a deer in the savannah sunlight. I would use more of a buff titanium, whereas something from a hell realm, I would use this more grayish parchment tone, if that makes any sense. I also didn't make the inside of the mouth more of a bright pink, which I would have done for more of a living creature. Because this is a demon from hell, I decided to go with more of a crimson purple tone, like I did with the highlights in the hair, and using the same mother color as the skin tone. Now, I'm putting some preliminary colors in the skull holes and going over and adding a second layer, even though really I should give it more time to dry. And there's a bunch of touch-ups and layering going on in this process. I take some white as well to go over areas I had accidentally gotten paint on things like the sword, so that I can go over it later after it dries with bright, vibrant colors, where the sword is going to look like blue or turquoise lightning. And as well, I'm getting some paint off my hand quickly, and as well I go over such things on the flame whip so that the colors underneath won't affect the yellow and orange. If I'd been more careful not to get paint on there in the first place, I wouldn't need to do this extra step. But as I had made this mistake, I did need to do that extra step. I do many layers as well for the rock color below. I was stuck between whether I was going to make it look more volcanic, which was my initial idea, or make it look more of a neutral grayish rock. In the end, I end up making it look more of a neutral gray rock because that looks more like any environment this creature could have been summoned into. Although I picture it being more in a rocky volcanic environment in its home hellish plane, because this demon could have passed through a gateway or been summoned by someone, and it's a miniature that's going to be used for tabletops, such as Dungeons & Dragons, I ended up deciding that I wanted to sort of be more of a neutral gray rock to represent any location it could have been summoned or entered into. I do begin here by working more wet and wet with shades of almost black and dark gray, just trying to cover that pale gray primer a little bit more and get some layers in. Often acrylic paint works rather well if you do many layers, rather than working only with one layer. It's actually not quite as opaque and covering as I prefer. It doesn't work the same way as gouache, or you can work with certain other things like digital painting. You actually have to accept the fact that there's a certain level of transparency and layering required to do acrylic paint. I'm trying to work as thickly as I can manage with this paint because it's more how I prefer to work, but I also have to accept the limitations and the way that the material actually works. I use a soft, stiff, medium-sized makeup brush a bit here to get large coverage. I also use a very fine tip brush and some white paint to get in those mouth details. Now I'm not using pure white. I'm using that parchment color that I used for the skulls in with a bit of white. So it's not too bright and vibrant, it's a little dirtyish. I also clean up edges and add details on the gums and inside the mouth, including adding additional details. I add some shadows by mixing a shadow tone. I touch up the darkness inside the skulls and do a bunch of little detail work that I think would improve the look of things. In certain areas, if I make a mistake, I wait for it to dry enough and go over and make corrections with the other color. If I went outside of where I intended to with the black for the skulls, I go over it with the parchment. I put an underlayer of pure white where the eyes are so that I can put a vibrant yellow on them later, which will make them look bright and glowing. If I didn't put the underlayer of white, the yellow wouldn't show up properly at all. I dry brush on some gray highlights, but I'm also switching between what I'm doing so that I can enjoy the process. I'm going back in and adding further darkness details and other work on it. After letting it dry thoroughly so the white was fully dry, I come back in to get the details in the final parts. The final details, the eye, and the glowing weapons. I decide whether or not I'm going to put reflected light, but I end up deciding I'm going to put some reflected light. It's a little bright, the reflected light, so it ends up looking like he's in shadow. This miniature looks best in somewhat dim lighting, because then it makes the glow of the weapons look like they're creating a lot of light on the miniature. Whereas in very bright light, I find it looks like the glow is a little too bright as compared to the light hitting the miniature itself, but still I really enjoy this look. I'm working wet and wet with more of a shiny white and the turquoise color. Now I work with a very bright lemon yellow, a very bright white, and more of an azo yellow. I was originally going to use more orange and red here, but then I decided the bright yellow, the faint golden tone is all that this would really need. I decided to do some reflected light, some glow hitting the underside of the wings and other surfaces nearby. I'm working as quickly as I can, not only to save time in filming, but also because some of the wet on wet techniques and blending out works better when the paint's still wet. Merging in the golden tone with the lemon tone is a little bit better in terms of making the fire look realistic, in my opinion. If I do the edges with the golden tone, the azo yellow, while the lemon yellow is still wet, I misted them a bit there. I also went back over here and decided to put some of the glow effects. I'm finding the surfaces that light should be hitting from the weapon, and I'm putting it in. Yes, it's nerve-wracking and kind of scary, and you feel like you're ruining the detailed paint job you did before. But at the same time, these lighting effects can look quite spectacular. So you need to decide how much of a lighting effect you're putting as reflected light affects everything nearby. Are you working into the whole miniature? I personally haven't used my airbrush yet because I'm too afraid of breaking it or cleaning it wrong, but eventually I probably should actually try to use it. Although I probably won't be able to film that because I'm very careful about toxic and dangerous supplies and equipment. So I'll probably be airbrushing things like primer on unprimed miniatures outside in large batches, rather than actually working indoors with my airbrush on days where it's not raining. I'm carefully going back in and adding touch-ups. I'm actually very happy with the way this looks, and the final bit is the eyes. Here's one last look at it while it's still wet. Well, it's fully dry, and here it is on some terrain. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be using this miniature in my games at some point in the future. That's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.